And I asked this person, what do you know about Hinduism? And he said, well, I just told you, I know it's an awful religion, it's a terrible religion, I have no respect for it. But what do you know about it? Well, he didn't seem to know anything more about it than that. Often people are making blindingly large judgments about the other based on ignorance and fear rather than some kind of knowledge. Or as I told somebody recently, you may have stereotypes about Islam. Why don't you read some surahs of the Quran?
You've been studying Hinduism for more than 40 years. So while being a Catholic priest, you have all this depth and serious interest in a completely another religion.
So when I got there in '73, not knowing anything about Hinduism and Buddhism, to teach in the school for 2 years, all the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist, and the country was perhaps 99% Hindu and Buddhist. So for me, it was a great opening experience, but rather the idea was to learn from one's own tradition, then learn as best one could at the different levels from the other tradition, and then allow that to shed the light back on one's home tradition. But one of the most important documents published near the end in English in our times was a document that committed the church to interreligious dialogue and interreligious learning. Is a way of being fully committed to openness, grounding in faith, but openness to the other is a very good way of being a Roman Catholic. But when I read the holy text of the Hindus, somehow that was the voice of God speaking to me. Or when I went to a beautiful Hindu temple, it's not my place of worship, but it's a sense of the immediacy of God's presence. And as we Jesuits say, finding God everywhere, became to me like my compass, my guide, allowing me to trust that God was with me, even when, for many people, I was in places that were very not Christian. God opens God's self to everyone who wishes to be devout, to be generous. Jesus says in the gospel, if you want to be saved, then you have to love your neighbor. And so some sense that pluralism is always in danger as a doctrinal position of becoming relativism. You have to respect everybody as a human being. But I don't want to be a pluralist in the sense of a relativist, because I think that is a bad path, but rather my truth that I live, the truth you live, are somehow next to one another, and that can be a powerful way of living, truth meeting truth. But that when we're speaking of the reality of God, our limited human perspectives, even if we feel that the holy text given to my tradition is true, we may not even understand the text that's been given to us. Some say that the best theology ends in silence, when we no longer are talking all the time, but are able to stop talking. So ironically, the more he became a staunch Catholic, the more he was able to be open to the experience of God in other religions as well. And that's a very admirable example, I think. I mean, I'm a Catholic, but right back almost 50 years to Kathmandu, a sense of crossing over, experiencing God present in the Hindu temple and the sacred scriptures of the Hindu. A pious Muslim reading the New Testament might find many passages to disagree with, but you know them better when you've read them, and you say, okay, that's what John says, that's what Mark says, and I see that. I'm not afraid of it, I don't agree with it, and I will keep it in mind. And the times I've heard at a mosque recitation of surahs from the Quran, I don't know a word of Arabic, or maybe 2 words of Arabic, but it's so beautiful to hear the recitation that I think it has a good spiritual effect.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we are interviewing Professor Francis Clooney, who's talking to us from the US, from Boston. Professor Clooney joined Harvard Divinity School faculty in 2005, where he is currently a professor of divinity and comparative theology. After earning his doctorate in University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. And from 2010 until 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. He's the author of several books, such as Theology After Vedanta, An Experiment in Comparative Theology. Another book, The Truth, the Way, the Life, Christian Commentary on the Holy Mantras of the Shrivya Znaza Hindus. Another book, Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders. Another book, His Hiding Place is Darkness, a Hindu Catholic Theopoetics of Divine Absence. He's also a Roman Catholic priest, and he is currently president-elect of the Catholic Theology Society of America. So welcome, Doctor. It's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you.
So in the beginning, tell us more about yourself, your personal, academic, and spiritual journey, your interest in religion studies, and especially in comparative theology, how this interest started in your life, how it developed, certain teachers, books, incidences which influenced your life and your decisions mainly. You mentioned also in one of your books that you've been studying Hinduism for more than 40 years. So I'd like to hear also about this unique experience. So while being a Catholic priest, you have all this depth and serious interest in a completely another religion.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me for this interview. I'm happy to speak with you and to have this opportunity. So let me say a few things. You asked large and many questions all at once. So I'll say a few things and then you can follow up with further questions. So you gave a nice introduction, but I would just affirm that I'm from New York City, born in Brooklyn, New York. Very traditional Catholic background, Roman Catholic background, Catholic primary school, Catholic high school, then entered the seminary when I was 18 years old in order to become a Jesuit priest. Went through the 10 years of training in order to be ordained a Catholic priest. In the course of that training, against the background of my traditional learning, Latin and Greek, the classic literature of the Christian tradition, I was able to spend 2 years in Kathmandu, up Nepal, up in the Himalayas, a kingdom that only in the last half of the 20th century began to open up to the wider world. But in those days, in the 70s, was a very beautiful and somewhat remote kingdom where the Jesuit fathers had been invited in by the king of Nepal to set up a school about 25 years earlier. So when I got there in 73, not knowing anything about Hinduism and Buddhism, to teach in the school for 2 years, all the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist, and the country was perhaps 99% Hindu and Buddhist. So for me, it was a great opening experience. And I think for some people, it would have been a good experience and then move on to other things. Some may have been inclined to stay there and to be part of the work of the school in the future. But I had the insight that what I was learning there from Hindu tradition, Buddhist tradition, from the boys I was teaching, from the festivals in the city and so on, was eye-opening for me as a Roman Catholic. And it didn't make me want to become a Hindu or Buddhist. I had my own grounding in my own faith. But it seemed to me for the first time in my life, having grown up in the very Catholic part of New York City, this was an opportunity to open my horizons, to open my boundaries, to begin to learn from other religious traditions in a way that was like shedding light on my tradition rather than threatening it or darkening it in some way. So after I spent the 2 years in Kathmandu, then I finished theology study in seminary, then I was ordained a priest. Then, as you mentioned, I think I went to the University of Chicago to do my doctoral studies. And I felt that instead of simply having a personal experience in Kathmandu be good, I needed to study deeply the Hindu traditions that I had been exposed to. And just as in the Christian tradition, I learned Latin and Greek in order to read the classics and the New Testament. I wanted to learn the languages. So I spent a lot of time at the University of Chicago learning the Sanskrit language, the classical language of India, and then also Tamil, the South Indian language of Tamil Nadu. And so learning these two languages, then I began to read the literature. I spent a year plus in Madras in South India, now Chennai, in 82, 83, went deeper in my knowledge, deeper in my learning. And then, as you said, got the job teaching at Boston College, which is a big Catholic university, in 84. And I began to use my learning. So being trained in my own tradition as a Catholic and Catholic priest, and also having a PhD in Hindu studies, that I began to use these in teaching comparative courses at Boston College, both for the undergrad, the BA students, and then also for the MA and PhD students. And it wasn't, in my mind, comparative religion, which can be kind of a scientific historical study comparing and contrasting religions. And it wasn't evangelical in the sense of let's compare them to see which one is better, but rather the idea was to learn from one's own tradition, then learn as best one could at the different levels from the other tradition, and then allow that to shed the light back on one's home tradition. So I began to do that at BC. I began, teaching and also writing, as you mentioned, some of my books. Was able to go back to India many more times for shorter or longer periods. And even at Harvard now, I continue the same process of teaching comparative courses, which enable students to come to terms with their own background, but then also to learn another tradition and then to see the mutual illumination between the two. So that's a start, and I'd be happy to have any questions for clarification that you'd like to follow up with.
So, Professor, I'll quote here from one of your books, two quotes that you mentioned. The Catholic Church rejects nothing of the things which are true and holy in these religions, where you refer to other religions like Hinduism or Buddhism. And another quote where it says, whatever truth and grace is to be found among religions is a sort of secret presence of God. So based on the introduction that you presented, how do you feel the importance of knowing or studying another religion for any person, for example, a Muslim or a Christian, like getting to know a completely another religion and find wisdom and grace and manifestations of grace and God there?
Yeah. I mean, first I would say that the quote you read first is from one of the most important Catholic teachings of the past 60 years, the meeting called Vatican II, which was a meeting in Rome of all the bishops of the world, 1962 to 1965, was a time for renewal in the church, change in many different aspects. But one of the most important documents published near the end in English in our times was a document that committed the church to interreligious dialogue and interreligious learning. Part of it was about relations with the Jewish people, part about relationship with Muslims, and then part that you quoted from about relations to Hindus and Buddhists and Confucians and Taoists and so on, other people. And I think what was striking about the part you read is that the church, even conservative bishops, were saying that truth is to be found everywhere, and that what is good and holy can be found everywhere. And therefore, there is no value for the church in closing down and saying, we have the entire truth and they have no truth, but rather that there is truth and beauty and goodness everywhere in the world. And this is seen from a Christian perspective, that it would be the belief that God is present, Christ is present everywhere in the world. But the effect of it was to inculcate in the church a great respect for the texts, the rituals, the music, the imagery, the practices of other religions. And I think that would be the first thing. The second would be, I think, what is the theology underlying it? I think this would be a thing that many believers would agree on, that if there's only one God, we don't have many different gods. You don't have, every country doesn't have its own, or every language has its own deity and so on. There's one God, and therefore a God who made the world, God who preserves the world, God who is the supreme teacher, makes it possible everywhere in the world for some kind of presence of God to be felt. And I think by human experience, by human thinking, by human art and music, by human progress, that all of this is not secular, but it's really within the mystery of God. Of course, there will be disagreements about the name of God or, doctrinal differences among different traditions. But particularly, I think if you think of Jews and Christians and Muslims, that we really have a long tradition of, I think, believing in the one God, and that the one God who is present is not my possession or your possession, but really is giving us the world in which we need to live in peace and learn from one another. So I think that's the attitude that I bring to my work. And it made it possible for me to say, as a Roman Catholic, because I didn't want to go against the church or leave the church, that learning and being as open as possible is part of the way Catholics are told we should act in the late 20th century, early 21st century. It's not a liberal thing. It's not a less Catholic thing, but rather it's this idea of being fully committed is a way of being fully committed to openness, grounding in faith, but openness to the other is a very good way of being a Roman Catholic. And that, I think, was inspiring the passages that you just read.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Doctor, before continuing this conversation, you mentioned in the introduction that you traveled to India several times and you studied the Hindu texts and you learned other languages and you have interest in this area. So, given your interest in these areas, my question here will be about this interest specifically. How did it start? And you talked specifically about your academic path. I'd like to hear about your spiritual involvement, because normally people, they don't work only academically. Certain people or certain spiritual incidences affect or influence their life or their decisions. So did you encounter certain spiritual factors that affected your academic or your path in general?
I think so. I mean, to put it in simple terms, so as I mentioned earlier, I entered the seminary at age 18. I just 4 or 5 days before turned 18 from 17. So I was very young. And why did I do that? This was in the late 1960s. And it was not a time when many people were running off to become monks or priests or nuns, whatever. But I think I had already had in my life a very strong sense of God's presence, that although I was Catholic, or as a Catholic, it wasn't so much simply going to church or saying the prayers or reading the Bible, but I had a very strong sense of God with me, God in my life, God close to me. And I think that always gave me a sense of confidence that wherever I was, whether it was actually in the church, in the seminary, or somewhere far away, that God was going to be with me. And I think what happened to me when I mentioned early, when I got to Kathmandu for those 2 years, then in the 80s, when I went to Madras, then I went back again and again and again, I was finding that God was with me even when everyone around me was Hindu or everyone around me was Buddhist. And that there wasn't a sense of God is somewhere else or God is behind. But when I read the holy text of the Hindus, somehow that was the voice of God speaking to me. Or when I went to a beautiful Hindu temple, it's not my place of worship, but I was not the kind of person to be offended and saying, oh, this is terrible, this is idolatry, but rather these are holy places with holy people praying in a holy way, and that this was somehow a gift from God to me. So even aside from the intellectual commitment, this is a way of realizing God who has spoken to me from my youth is the same God who meets me when I travel, when I go to new places, when I visit holy places of other traditions. God is somehow there with me, telling me, open your eyes, listen, don't be afraid. So I'm not sure this is answering your question, but it's a sense of the immediacy of God's presence. And as we Jesuits say, finding God everywhere became to me like my compass, my guide, allowing me to trust that God was with me, even when, for many people, I was in places that were very not Christian, but of other religions, that God would be there too, because God is everywhere, and I felt this personally in my own life.
As we say in one of the verses of the Quran, أينما تولوا فثم وجه الله. Wherever you go, there is the face of God. So why do you think until now that traditional religious teachings doesn't give a person this broad-minded and this openness to other traditions and religions, this openness to wisdom wherever it manifests, and until now, like, they give you a very closed-minded, and you have to be you have to fare from other traditions or religions or cultures, and you have to keep on your theologies, and you have to believe in them in a certain closed way. So why do you think and I think maybe your peers or your friends, they didn't go on the same path, and they don't agree on this type of openness, and there are very few people who choose certain such paths?
Well, I think, I mean, I have my understanding of the history of religion, you might say, my reading of the Bible. I don't know Arabic, so I've only read the Holy Quran in English rendering. And then the text of the Hindus is that every tradition has, you might say, a very inward-looking, very trenchant part about God is with us and we need to protect this sacred faith. And I think insofar as traditions have this side, which is perfectly sensible, is that it's not to be easily opened up. It's not to be even necessarily compared to other traditions, but to have a strong faith. Our God is the only God. The God of Israel for Christians and Jews is the God. Jesus Christ is the only Savior. And I think this is, in part, a very deep sense of the absoluteness of the experience, or the absoluteness of what God has done for us is incomparable, is not like anything else. And this can turn then into doctrines. It can turn into teachings about other religions. And it can come across, particularly in now, I think, as a very conservative view. Our view is the right view, when what we're really trying to say, even in those terms, is that God has come to us in an absolute way. God has come to us in a complete, full way, which then in human words, we translate into, well, that means that we have the truth, they don't have the truth. So that's the one side of it. But I think, I don't know the Holy Quran at all, really. I mean, I've just read in English. But I think certainly in the Bible, there are both very particular exclusive parts, only the God of Israel, only Jesus Christ, the pagans will be lost, and so on. But there are other parts that preach the universality. God made the world. God opens God's self to everyone who wishes to be devout, to be generous. Jesus says in the gospel, if you want to be saved, then you have to love your neighbor. The Last Judgment scene in the Gospel of Matthew, where the Son of God comes and sits on the throne, and some are cast down into hell and some are brought up into heaven, is not about doctrine. It's not about, did you come to our house of worship on the holy day? But it says, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? When I was in prison, did you visit me? And I think there is this kind of universal side to, I think, every tradition, where all these strictures about this alone, God alone, us alone, are balanced by the sense, but surely God is greater than that. Surely God wants more than that. And again, in the biblical tradition, we have the reading this Sunday even, the two commandments that all are called to live by is love God and love your neighbor. And I think love of God can open up into a universality, but love of neighbor means that religion and one's true faith is never an excuse for hating your neighbor, for cruelly attacking your neighbor, for even insulting your neighbor, saying, well, your religion is worthless or your faith is worthless. But somehow even a strong sense of God as true in my tradition is accompanied by a sense, we are all brothers and sisters. We need to connect to one another. So I don't know if you agree, but I think every tradition would have some tension between this is the only path and God is the God of the whole world. no one is outside God's love and God's mercy.
So after specializing in comparative theology and being introduced to other religions and especially Hinduism, so what's your perspective in about pluralism, or what they say religious pluralism? You're aware that there are several modern theories by Said Hussein Nasr, or the perennial wisdom, or the perennial school that you have in the States, or other people who try to talk about this issue. You have Heck, John Heck, which is a famous Christian theologian, which talked about this issue. So in which kind of pluralism do you believe that, about all the different kinds of seekers towards God? You went to India and you saw how Hindu and Buddhist people worship and pray, and they have the sincere relations to God. So how you perceive all this change, and you're still a Christian, so it's not only about respecting other people, it's about deep theology about pluralism. So what do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a very good question, and I think it's pushing the issue forward as we must. And I would say on the first level that the theologians you mentioned, Professor Nasser, John Hick, and a host of others, are all trying to figure out the meaning of pluralism in the 20th and now the 21st century. That this is not easy to do, that we expect people to have a hard time understanding physics or chemistry or biology or something else. I think we take for granted all religious answers should be simple. And so I think everyone is trying to explain, and sometimes people get it better than others. But I don't think, again, with this kind of thinking honestly about pluralism, I don't think we want to be in a position of saying, well, those people think that because they have bad faith, or those people think that because they're not believers, but rather a sense of, in most cases, people are trying to understand. So when it comes to the thinking about pluralism, I think two perceptions I have. One perception is that people who propose a radically pluralistic view, many different religions, many different ways to the divine, many different pathways that are all to be respected. In some sense, they're simply recognizing reality, in the sense that we live in a world where many different religions flourish. And not in my lifetime, and you're much younger than me, but not in your lifetime, will everyone have one religion only. And so I think now with modern communication, immigration, pluralization, we're all living in societies where people have to learn to recognize that their neighbor may have a different faith. And that the idea that we can have a purely Catholic country, or a purely Hindu country, or purely Muslim country is really, I think, not only wishful thinking, but perhaps bad thinking, because it does injustice to the plurality of who people are. So that's on sort of the factual level. And I think because we don't want to be fighting religious wars, and we don't want to be terrorizing people who think differently than us, then there has to be some kind of pluralism of respect, a sense that we all deserve respect. We are all brothers and sisters, whatever the religious motivation for saying that. And therefore, by pluralism, I can't look at somebody else passing by on the street here or something like that and say, but those people live merely in error, or those people are merely wrong, or they must be evil people because they don't believe as we believe. So that kind of pluralism of respect, pluralism of just de facto. But I think that the other level would be, is pluralism theologically or doctrinally the case? And I've never agreed with that. Because my view as a Roman Catholic is that I have deep commitments in my own religious tradition and very strong language, as I said earlier, alongside the universality of God's love everywhere. There are strong statements about salvation in Jesus Christ, or Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And I don't think those statements have to be taken as hostile to others, but it's not possible to say, well, that's what the Christians think. And then if you read the Bhagavad Gita about Lord Krishna, Krishna is the only way. Well, that's what they think. That's their opinion. And then something from Islam or something from Buddhism. Well, that's their way. That's their opinion. It's like saying, well, somebody is seriously ill and different doctors just say, well, I think I'll cut open here, or I think I'll cut open there, or I think I'll do this or that. They can't all be right because a life is at stake. And so some sense that pluralism is always in danger as a doctrinal position of becoming relativism. And relativism says the reason we don't want to fight religiously is because none of the things we say are really absolutely true. They're all relative. All of them are partly true, partly not true. And therefore we should just not bother each other and just live in peace. And that's, relativism then becomes close to secularism, where religion is privatized, where it's just a matter of opinion. And if you believe something or don't believe something, we respect you. And of course, we do have to respect even atheists. We have to respect everybody as a human being. But I don't want to be a pluralist in the sense of a relativist, because I think that is a bad path that is not true to my tradition, your tradition, Hindu tradition, Buddhist tradition, any tradition. What I call myself in the Anglican and Catholic traditions, we pair pluralism with exclusivism and inclusivism. And exclusivism is often seen as a lesser position because it's the position that says, this is true and the rest is not true. Only this is true. And I don't favor that because I've had too much learning of Hinduism. I've traveled too much. I've seen the other. An exclusivist position, which says because we believe this, then what you believe is false, it doesn't work for me. But the other position, an inclusivist position, is really an effort to try to say both and. It is absolutely to be a matter of faith for Catholics. God speaks to us in our tradition. Jesus Christ is the manifestation of God. Jesus is God on earth, and therefore we have that firm faith. But on the other hand, that does not give us permission to imagine that God speaks only to us. And I think this opens the door not so much to an ism, but to an including, where you can say, well, here is my faith, but my faith can include respect for the Bhagavad Gita or the beliefs of Hindus. Here is my sense of God as my savior. I think I can include Hindu views of salvation, and so on. That it's sort of a balanced view. Some people may say it really is just pluralism because having my truth and respecting your truth could sound relativistic. But my hope would be that we can say, without watering it down, without becoming secularized, that the truth that I believe and follow can stand next to the truth that you believe and follow, without having to say either one is true and the other is false, or neither is true, so let's just be friends. But rather, my truth that I live, the truth you live, are somehow next to one another, and that can be a powerful way of living, truth meeting truth, rather than truth trying to erase error, but truth and truth together.
Mm-hmm. So being away from relativism, many of the people who study comparative theology from different religions, they believe in inclusivism, just as you said. So they believe that they are the best, they are the superior, they're 100, but other people are not totally false. Certain levels of truth and reality manifest in their traditions and religions. 20%, 70%, maybe 90%, the voice of God can reach them. But in the same time, they believe that they are the best or they are the superior. So many religions, many people in different religions believe in that. But I think can we have a different level also, a higher level of understanding for other religions? Because after studying, and because also you have Meister Eckhart, he's a great mystic, and some people compare between Ibn Arabi in Islam and Meister Eckhart in Christianity, and Shankara, for example, in Buddhism, I think, or in Hinduism.
Hinduism.
So they feel that same realities are being expressed in different ways, and then the certain verses you mentioned in the Gospels or in Quran, they can have hermeneutic or mystical interpretations and explanations. So we get rid of the closed understanding of certain verses. It's a matter of every person to choose his own religion because he feels that it's the perfect picture for him or it's the perfect path for him. But that doesn't mean that the same grace and the same opportunity can't be given to other religions. So you can be best in your eyes or for your society or for your path, but maybe the wide mercy of God opened an equivalent path for another person. If we don't try to think like this, we'll still be inclusivists in a certain way or another, even if we claim that we are exclusivists. So what do you think?
I think you're a great theologian. I think that's what I think. So I think you speak very eloquently of these things. So thank you. Two things I would add. I mean, one would be more mystical, you might say. If we are going to be believers in our faith tradition, we have to have a certain humility that we don't really know what we're talking about. Because we can say, well, if I'm a certain kind of pragmatist, experimentalist in science or something, I can go out and pick something up and look at it, and I can chop it up and figure it out. And I can do this and that experiments. But that when we're speaking of the reality of God, our limited human perspectives, even if we feel that the holy text given to my tradition is true, we may not even understand the text that's been given to us. And the sense that we as limited human beings do not have an infinite mind and heart like God does. And therefore, we always have to be careful to say what I think this means, or what I think for me as a Catholic, what I think Jesus means. I may have only an inkling of what Jesus means. And I think there is a sense, therefore, we are entering into a great mysterious reality. You mentioned Meister Eckhart, Ibn Arabi, Shankara, Ramanuja, the Buddha, and so on. These great thinkers, Maimonides in Jewish tradition, these great thinkers who I think were at their best when they realized we say this, we say this, we say this, we say this, and then we realize that much of what we said has a question mark next to it, or much we have to then say, but I haven't said, I can't say, I don't know how to say, that our words begin to fall short. Some say that the best theology ends in silence, when we no longer are talking all the time, but are able to stop talking. The other thing I would say is more technical. I think you are right in saying there's a certain kind of inclusivism that says our tradition is the superior tradition. Our tradition is the great tradition, but we have some room to include yours at a lower level. So we have the fullness of truth. You have part of the truth. We see the whole picture. You only see part of the picture. Therefore, there's a sense of tolerance in a condescending sense, a condescension where we are here and you're down there, but we accept you, we tolerate you, that's all you can do. But I think another kind of including is what I was trying to say as a practice that for me as a Catholic, so I go to the church every Sunday, I say Mass at the altar, I read the gospel, I preach for the people and so on. That I think is possible to stand alongside, including in my experience, also going to the Hindu temple, respectfully seeing, hearing, showing postures that are respectful, and opening myself to God in that experience. And that is a kind of including the realities and piety of Hindu life, thinking, practice, somehow within the reality of my life as a practicing Catholic. So it's a kind of inclusion that I try to think doesn't wipe out the truth of what I believe, but it opens it up that I don't need to keep the other out. And it certainly doesn't mean mine is up here and yours is down there, but rather that they meet. And I believe the truth of my tradition without compromise, but it doesn't mean what people say they think it means when they say, because this is true, then that must be false, or this is 100% true, that's only 22% true. I don't think it's like that. And nobody's asking me to pass judgment. I think it's important for us also to say, those of us who are educated or intellectuals or teachers or religious leaders, I think we don't have to go around saying good religion, bad religion, true and false, but rather ask people to go deeper into their own tradition, to pray, to study, to listen to teachers, to practice, and then not be afraid to learn from the other, to include the other in their way of living. Just as I said, in pluralistic societies, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a very diverse area around Harvard University. I don't think it would be a better Cambridge if I said all the non-Catholics should get out and we'll only have Catholics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That would be crazy. It's not possible. It's not even a good idea. And I think to say,
even for the academic experience, knowledge, wisdom that should be gained,
Yeah.
interaction with different ideas.
Right, exactly. So if you have a university where you say, well, everybody at the university has to follow the following creed or the following doctrines and no diversity of opinion, that's not even possible because different believers will read the scripture differently. And that's why you have commentaries and so on. But also, if we're only talking to ourselves and say everybody in the room agrees because we're refusing to let anyone else in, then that becomes rather dull and also close-minded. And it's sort of this downward path where talking to fewer and fewer people and everybody else is an unbeliever. And finally, you're just talking to yourself. And what good is that? That's a very narrow view of truth. Only I have the truth.
Some mystics, including some Muslim mystics, believe that the same truth and reality can be manifested in different shapes and forms and languages, but it's the same. So that this widens the same reality that you feel unique because it's manifesting in different shapes and eras. So, for example, there is a famous saying of Ibn Arabi where he says, "My heart has became receptive or capable of all forms." Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, different kinds of forms. I believe in the religion of love wherever it takes me. It's a kind of a translation. It's a weak translation. It has a precise saying. So he believes that a mystic who sees with his heart can understand and can recognize the religious experiences that are felt with different people of faith of different religions because he feels them, he undergoes them. Just as you said, going in a temple or going in a church or entering a mosque and feeling the deep existential feeling that these seekers and people who are praying are feeling. So in this level, a certain mystic can see what's happening in the hearts of these people who are worshiping the same God.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. I gave actually two things. I gave a talk a few weeks ago at a Hindu temple, a Vedanta society, Ramakrishna Vedanta Society. And the great mystic, Sri Ramakrishna, a 19th century mystic, he had a very strong love of God as his mother. And he was totally devoted to God as his mother, the goddess Kali. But as he grew older, he had this very strong sense of experiencing the truth, as you said, of Christian faith, Muslim faith, Buddhist faith, and that he somehow could cross over because he was deeply rooted in his own faith. That sort of opened him up into an experience, not just talking about, but this deep experience of God in all the places that he went to. I'm also speaking soon about Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk, who was a great figure for his own spiritual journey, but also later in his life, as a Trappist monk, deeply rooted in Catholic faith, piously living a life of silence in the monastery, increasingly learning Zen Buddhism, learning Sufi Islam, learning from the Hindus and the Buddhists, and saying, because I am a committed Catholic and I have this effort to open myself to the mystical graces that God gives me, this means that the graces that God gives to others are not entirely alien to me or foreign for me. So ironically, the more he became a staunch Catholic, the more he was able to be open to the experience of God in other religions as well. And that's a very admirable example, I think. And I would say, just on a more conceptual level, if we live in a world of many religions, and if we study other religions, and if our knowledge of other religions is only ideas or only what we read on the page, and we never have an experience that crosses the boundary, like we never have emotion arising in our heart or love or a sense of God in the other, it probably means we're not doing it as well as we could. because it would be like saying, well, I love you deeply. I don't really know anything about you. I've never really talked to you intimately. Oh, but I think you're wonderful and I love you. It's very superficial. So there has to be some crossover. Whereas, as I said, I mean, I'm a Catholic, but right back almost 50 years to Kathmandu, a sense of crossing over, experiencing God present in the Hindu temple and the sacred scriptures of the Hindu. And it doesn't mean all experiences are the same. It doesn't mean, therefore, that everything is okay, because there can be dangerous experiences. There can be things that go wrong. But some sense of resonating, feeling deeply united with God and the other, I think is something we can be open to in the 21st century.
And the experience of faith for a person actually deepens because he comes to know how God manifests in different shapes, in different colors, and he gets to know the majesty of God that is manifested in different societies, cultures, religions, languages, because language, the language is a whole thing to talk about, how the religion is manifested in language. So, and I guess you talk also about wisdom and how we should see things as they are. We have a saying in Islam which says, Allahumma arini al-ashya' kama hiya. God, show me things as they look, So I think you mentioned here also impurity is to be removed. Knowledge illumines our situation so that nothing is obscured or shadowed, and this infatuates in a totally truthful encounter with reality, just as it is.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is in part indebted to my study of Vedanta and the teachings of the Upanishads, of Shankara, Ramanuja, the Hindu teachers, where they say the great problem in life is ignorance, and that we are people like who have either a veil over our face we can't see, or we have something like an eye disease and our eyes are obscured and we can barely make anything out. Part of the goal of learning and study is to remove all the veils, to remove the blindness, to turn on the light. And I think whenever I run into somebody, as I did recently, I was talking to somebody who said, I really have no respect for Hinduism. It's a terrible religion. It's an awful religion. And I asked this person, what do you know about Hinduism? And he said, well, I just told you, I know it's an awful religion. It's a terrible religion. I have no respect for it. But what do you know about it? Well, he didn't seem to know anything more about it than that. And I think that sense, or I would never read those books because they're bad books. You don't know anything about what's in them. You have no idea how they sound. You have no idea what they mean for people. Often people are making blindingly large judgments about the other based on ignorance and fear rather than some kind of knowledge. And I would say, to my fellow Catholics, so it would be good if you read the Bhagavad Gita. Or as I told somebody recently, you may have stereotypes about Islam. Why don't you read some surahs of the Quran? And I'm not saying to the person, you therefore have to agree with everything you read, but you do have to understand it. And you
mentioned about Surah Maryam, so how even if in your theology it's wrong ideas or wrong theologies, but you come to understand how Mary is presented in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example. I mean, it's a beautiful surah in the Quran, and Mariam or Mary is honored so greatly in that chapter of the Quran. It's named after her. All this on the prophets, and different prophets are mentioned, and then climaxing in the middle with Mary, and the alternate story about going into the desert, having her child alone in the desert. God creates, I think, a fig tree and creates water for her so she's not abandoned. And that's all very beautiful. And I've actually used that even in Christmas sermons sometimes, about telling people, think of the story this way too, about the birth of Jesus. And people like that. But then parts of the chapter are doctrinally more difficult for Catholics, where the point seems to be Jesus making clear that he's not God and that God has no son. And I think I come to those parts, and I think, again, nobody's asking me to be the judge sitting on the throne saying, this is right, this is wrong. I can notice the strong faith in my tradition. Jesus is the Son of God, eternally manifest, who has come into the world. And I'm not going to, read some other holy text and say, therefore, I've changed my mind, at least not me. But I don't need to say, well, therefore, this is so wrong, or therefore the prophet made a mistake here or something. But rather, this is what the prophet says. This is his understanding of Jesus. And I hear it, I learn from it. I can't see how that exactly fits into my faith. But there's no reason for me to attack it or try to burn the book or disrespect the tradition or something. And I would hope the same would be true the opposite, that a pious Muslim reading the New Testament might find many passages to disagree with, but you know them better when you've read them, and you say, okay, that's what John says, that's what Mark says, and I see that. I'm not afraid of it. I don't agree with it, and I will keep it in mind without being threatened by it. Mm-hmm. And without saying none of these things are true and it's all human poetry anyway, but saying it's a clear truth claim that is different from mine, but I learned from hearing it without covering my ears and refusing to listen.
Interesting. Doctor, also in your book you mentioned some sentences which I feel very similar to our Sufi and mystical ideas in Islam, where you quote Meister Eckhart in one of his sermons: the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. We have a very famous hadith which is very similar to this verse. And then you say, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. So we have similar sayings in Islam. So what do you mean by this? It's a deep mystical meaning, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so again, Meister Eckhart, but the second quote beautifully from St. Paul, who was a very devout Christian, who had been a very devout Jew, and had this mystical experience of Christ, and then a very strong sense of preaching Christ around the Roman Empire, around the Mediterranean. Everyone should know Jesus. But he went beyond simply having, here's my message, here's my book, buy my book, or you should all come over to my side, of realizing that if he was to experience Christ, then in a sense he would lose his self in the greater self of Christ. So as you read that beautiful passage, is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Is no longer me sitting over here thinking about God over there, but suddenly I realize that my consciousness opens into God consciousness. And I think that, again, sense of humility, that we are not in charge. I don't own my religion. It's not like a franchise where my job is to increase membership. We're not competing like two corporations, but rather to see that if mystics in different traditions like St. Paul and like Meister Eckhart and Ibn Arabi and others have this sense of the infusion of divine light into consciousness that transforms who you are and what you say, well, that should be honored as a wonderful reality, without again saying, I'm sorry, I can't accept that because that would make us relativists. No, you accept it as it is without running to judgments about it. And I think that sense of in the Christian tradition, one of the most popular saints is St. Francis of Assisi, who had both a love of nature, a love of poverty, but he was mystically transformed even to receiving the holes of the nails of Jesus crucified in his hands and feet. And I think many people recognize that this is a very high mystical state, but there you have this poor man of Assisi who somehow is transformed and kind of becomes the crucified Christ. And he is one of the Christian saints who's most popular among Hindus. Not because they say, well, Francis is coming and now he's going to try to make us all become Christians and he's talking at us and so on. No, they saw somebody who was radiating the love of God, that it became his physical reality. And I think the great mystical saints in different traditions don't become competitors or don't become rivals, but rather to say these are gifts God gives to the world. And even if I can read Ibn Arabi for years, and I'm not going to become a Muslim or read Shankara for years and not become a Hindu. I'm a far better believing Christian because I know these figures and who they are and what they testify, rather than cutting them out, saying, I'll cover my eyes because I
As
don't
I
want to
say
learn.
it, saints are brothers on the same path, even if they wear differently or talk differently. So, Doctor, after you presented a beautiful sense of love and respect to different religions and traditions, now I'll ask you, so do you find a certain superiority in Christian mysticism where you don't find in other religions? You studied Hinduism and Eastern religions in depth, and maybe other religions you know a bit about them, but what do you feel that it's a value added, a very superior, beautiful idea that founded in Christian mysticism that you can't find in others? I'd like to hear from you.
Well, I would be cautious about saying you can't find it in others, because most things we find in our own tradition
or you find it in a very bright way.
Yeah, are being said elsewhere. Okay, so I think on one level, two things I would say. I mean, one level would be in terms of what is the message of Jesus, and the message of Jesus works because in some ways he is preaching, as I've mentioned before, the essence of the law, of the teaching given to Moses, is love of God and love of neighbor. And that a beauty about Christian tradition is that it's never solitary, love God, hate your neighbor, or love God, forget about other people. There is no justification in religion for persecuting other people or depriving people of their life or rights, but love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And the many things around that about the life of Jesus. He said these things, but he also put his life on the line. He suffered for the things he believed. So I think at the core of Christianity is a complete religion that has a whole way of looking at the world, that respects the reality of God, but also the reality of life in this world, and says, as St. James says in his letter, if you say you love God, but you do nothing for your neighbor, then you're a liar. And I think this sense of the Christian tradition, I think, is quite wonderful. But I would not say, I think immediately we could find these principles, as I just said, in the Jewish faith. Love God, love your neighbor. And I think I would be foolish to say, and only Christians believe in love of God, love of neighbor. That would be ridiculous. So on one level, I think it's a tradition that works. And I think it's a tradition that has been able to adapt itself over time. The Catholic and Protestant traditions, the Orthodox traditions are everywhere in the world in many different cultures, and they find ways to live, as does Islam, as does Buddhism and Hinduism. They grow in new cultures. But on another level, I would say, a deep reason why I'm a Catholic is that there is nothing greater than the reality of Jesus Christ. And that the manifestation of God in Jesus Christ is a full manifestation of God. It's not just one manifestation. It's this complete encounter with God in the form of Jesus Christ, who speaks to us of the reality of God in a very intense and complete way. So I think there's nothing greater than that. But I don't translate that into saying, and therefore, this other religion only comes to 42%, and that one comes to 36%.
It's very interesting in the conversation. We're talking about superiority. In the same time, we can't neglect the pluralism and diversity at the same time. So
yeah,
they're combining together. So, Doctor, we have a little bit time left. I'll ask you about the picture, the image that's in the background. So what does it represent? It's a Hindu image.
Yes, well, you're right. The image right behind me, it was given to me about 3 years ago by a retiring professor. And it is, I'm sorry, it's not closer. I don't have a copy to show you on a big screen, but it's of the great Hindu theologian Ramanuja, 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 who lived 1,000 years ago. We just celebrated his 1,000th birth anniversary. And he was in the same tradition of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, but he believed that all the teachings of the mystics and all the teachings of the Gita led to an affirmation of a personal God, and that it's not radical non-dualism without God, but radical unity with God. And the sense that all the scriptures in the world all kind of point to the reality of God. And it's a living tradition today, the Vaishnava tradition of South India, with mystical saints and poetry and so on. And Ramanuja, I think, very much stands, even in the Indian context of today, about radical belief in the reality of God that is not hostile to other beliefs. Again, I think like Roman Catholics, his people may believe, oh, we have it the fullest way. But there's a sense of harmony that Ramanuja, as a great teacher, believed that all the scriptures could be brought together to testify to the reality of God. So it's a beautiful picture. It's a Tanjore painting. It's with gilt and all that. I have it on my wall for that reason, but also because I admire greatly his theological position that balances plurality and unity, diversity, and the one true God.
Very interesting. Doctor, we'll end here. If you have something to say about, because you talked about it, about art and music, and specifically art and its relation to Christian mysticism. I think you worked in a certain book about the mystical poetry and its relation to the ideas of.
I mean, I would just close, by saying I'm not an artist or a musician. I don't even write poetry. I translate poetry, but I don't write poetry. Is that, again, we shouldn't be simply people of words. Conceptual words, academic words, but performance, the beautiful, art, music, poetry, dance, all of these things become extremely important if we want to somehow capture through our five senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, the reality of the world and of God. We have to open it up to our bodily experience, to the sense of the beautiful. And I think this would be true interreligiously. So just the example I'd close with, both in hearing chant in a Hindu temple, the beautiful resonance of the Sanskrit chanting, even if somebody doesn't know the words, they can resonate with the sound. And the times I've heard at a mosque recitation of surahs from the Quran, I don't know a word of Arabic, or maybe 2 words of Arabic, but it's so beautiful to hear the recitation that I think it has a good spiritual effect. And likewise, the art, the iconography, the scene behind you. I don't read Arabic, but the beautiful inscription you have behind you. These things also speak to our eyes and to our hearts. So to have a sense of we do have doctrines, we do have truths, but also we have art, music, we have the imagination, we have poetry, and we should not be believers only in prose. We should be believers in poetry as well. And I think that's the challenge for us.
Professor Francis Clooney, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for sharing this knowledge with us today.
My happiness. Thank you.